Hello again, old souls. It's Dr. J, and boy, it's like looking like spring here, isn't it? Wow. Well, it's because it is spring here. So today's topic is like it's kind of a weird topic in the sense that it should be one of the most obvious topics for any community interested in spiritual growth and spirituality or the nature of the soul. And yet it remains kind of one of the more complicated and avoided topics. And it's the topic of why faith in God or a relationship with God matters. And I mean matters not in the cosmic sense of heaven and hell and what's going to happen to your soul or any of that kind of stuff. I mean like why it's so unbelievably helpful in life. I guess the starting point of this conversation, which is no surprise to any of you, is that probably most people avoid this conversation, even if God is important to them, because they just can't stand getting into arguments or discussions with people about what God is or isn't. So I would argue that when it comes to the concept of God, and forgive my language, but I think we've pretty much fucked it up. And I say that because we don't have a lot of great words in the English language for something that means God, but doesn't contain all the layers of history and innuendo and culture and conditioning. And yet, without a word, we go back to God, and then we're stuck. We're stuck again in the conditioning and the history. And an interesting parallel or example of how complicated it is when I talk about yin and yang. Now, some of you have heard me go on about this a lot, and some of you are thinking, oh, not this again. But one of the biggest challenges I have when I talk to groups about yin and yang is that I use the terms masculine and feminine. Yin being feminine in energy and consciousness, and yang being masculine in energy and consciousness. And yet, I am abundantly clear that I don't mean yin is female, meaning women are yin, and yang is male, meaning men are yang. This is a genderless concept, so it doesn't matter what a person's gender is, male or female, or no, man, woman, or any gender for that matter. It's about principles of nature, right? It's about the forces that are, alive in the spring buds and in the growing trees, right? There's a yin time of the day and a yang time of the day. There's a yin time of the year and a yang time of the year. And there's a yin phase for a tree and a yang phase for a tree. And each of those phases has its own yin and yang. Well, what the heck? I thought we were talking about God. The point is, no matter how many times I explain it or how much I'll explain it in a group setting, I will still find, sometimes after hours of being in workshops together, that people still fall back into this subconscious assumption that feminine means female and masculine means male. This is an illustration of the problem we have with the word God. It seems that we just can't shake the Judeo-Christian idea of it. So, for example, when we see scholars like Richard Dawkins attacking the idea of God, well, he's actually not attacking the idea of God. He's attacking an idea of God. He's talking about a God that is the kind of old world, God as male, God as a person-like character that actually makes decisions about our world and can be interacted with, I guess, something like Santa Claus, right? Bringing gifts and magic to those he favors and bringing destruction and chaos to those he doesn't. I mean, this is the same kind of logic behind, God helping one sports team to win and not another. And yet, even in the Judeo-Christian world, God was really, for many, many people, and certainly for many great mystics and saints and spiritual scholars, God was really a placeholder word, right? God was not meant to be a word that summarizes something with definition, but God was meant to be a word that captures a mystery and at least gives us the language to talk about it. So this is what I'm doing. I'm talking about it. In the modern world, I think that we've come to use other terms like higher power, like the universe, which I guess I'm starting to like more and more. Originally, I didn't really like calling God the universe because it seemed a little diminishing, but if God is implicit in the universe and God is the source and fabric of the universe, then okay, I think that's doable. God can also be known as consciousness or energy. And the funny thing I find in the modern Western world is that many people like you and me are eager to kind of find the right term, right? The right phrasing. If we look to cultures like in ancient India and the Hindu tradition, we find a kind of pluralism. And we also see that in indigenous traditions in the world. And when I say pluralism, what I mean is not only are they okay with multiple concepts of God, multiple names for God, but they actually welcome it, right? Like the more names for God, the better. So let's take a moment and talk about that. Let's talk a little bit about why a tradition like Hinduism would celebrate having so many names for God. As I understand it, and this would not be true for all Hindu people. I can't represent Hindu people any more I can represent anyone else, much less myself. But the idea that God is Krishna, that God is Saraswati, that God is Ganesha, that God is Narayana, that God is Vishnu, that God is Brahma, that God is Sat Chit Ananda, is not necessarily confusing because it's understood that the thing that we're referring to is so vast, so complex, so infinite and eternally dynamic that any and all of these names are valid because they all refer to aspects of the great mystery, aspects of the one source force, right? The one God. And so people then get to relate to that force through whatever vehicle, whatever name, whatever incarnation or avatar they feel called to. And so we start to see that the language for God in some traditions is implicitly understood as a mechanism of connection, and that the choice of language is a reflection of soul, not of God. In other words, if I can relate best to God as female, or God as earth, or God as Ganesha, then what matters is that I relate to God. It doesn't matter whether I'm right or wrong, because that is not the category of thinking to apply. It's truthfulness. It's the feeling of connection, and so on. So if you have a strong reaction to or resistance for a certain concept or articulation of God, there's no need to spend any energy being against it, because it's the articulation and the history of that name and vehicle that you're reacting to, not to the thing it names. In other words, you're not really reacting to God, you're reacting to what people have done with that particular name in that particular culture or approach, right? So you can't say, well, I'm okay with Allah, but I'm not okay with God, because ultimately they're references for the same thing. Now, this might seem like a bit of a rambling entry today, but I'm encouraging you to consider your resistance to not only the presence of God or a higher power in your life, but regular relationship to it, regular reference to it. And ultimately, where I want to end and what's most important about this conversation to me today is that relieving ourselves of all the resistance and struggle with the concept of God allows us to be in relationship with God, right? And what is the value of that? Well, the value of that in a simple way is that we can remember our shared identity, that we can find our place inside God and God inside us. And that means that when we struggle with life, yes, we can look through the lens of society and the transactional outer world. Yes, we can look at a situation through what Eckhart Tolle would call the pain body, or what I call the unresolved self, or the shadow. We can look at life through the authentic self, right? The soul. But whatever you're going through, whatever you're trying to understand, whatever you're trying to heal or move forward, you also have the capacity to sit inside God, to sit inside the mind of God, to see it from that place that lives in yourself. And what we find is that when we move to that universal space, the consciousness of undifferentiated unity with our universe, with our source, with all known and unknown reality, then things take on a different light. And I would argue that the biggest leap we can make in a life is not from the socialized, conditioned, arguably false self to the true authentic self, but it's actually from the true authentic self to the divine unitive self, the self that is the spirit self, the presence of God within, because this is the place where we move into non-duality. In this place, there is nothing to forgive. There's nothing to accept. This is the place that understands that the soul is just here for experience. And it's all lovable. It's all welcome, even the worst of it, because it is allowing the soul to understand. It's allowing the soul to evolve. And in that place of universal mind or spirit mind or the consciousness of God, we can create enough space around our problem thoughts, problem thinking, problem people, and then choose more skillfully. To conclude, at least for today on this topic, being in God consciousness, the place of radical acceptance and implicit forgiveness, doesn't mean that we no longer have to do healing work or evolve as people, but it means that it ceases to be aspirational. It ceases to be dualistic, and it becomes simply a function of wanting to be more fully engaged with life. And therefore, there can be no false self, only different experiences of life and identity. There can be no failure, and there can be no moment of your life where you are less spiritual than in any other. To heal our relationship with the concepts and history of God, to let all that go so that we can embrace a living relationship with the ultimate mystery of life, allows us to enter that mystery ourselves, to become that mystery ourselves, and in that way to experience all of life in its fullness. We cease to live in the domain of right and wrong, and we enter into the sublime, the ineffable, the beautiful, the terrible. And it's all a part of something beyond explanation. And it's enough. The experience is enough. Life is enough. Love is enough. Consider what keeps you from entering God consciousness. Consider what keeps you wrestling with how the outer world has handled the name of God. And let it all go. Let it all go. In your deepest meditation, in your deepest peace, in your deepest moments where you feel the oneness of life, that is your core. That is a way of being. That is a way of problem solving. That is a mindset. And there's no ego to protect. There's nothing to fear. There is only love. And from that place, we do not bypass life, but then we return to it more fully. And we hold our fear differently, and our conflict differently, and ourselves differently, and our differences differently, because we understand it's all just a play of sound and light. It becomes a journey, a search for beauty and meaning. With a moment-to-moment capacity to allow, with grace. And in that, to turn this love and acceptance to ourselves and find maybe an ultimate peace. I don't know, something to think about. Bye-bye.